Hello again, and thank you for joining us. My name is Emma Skalka, and I'm the VP of Sales and Marketing here at Victor Stanley and the co-chair of the board of TCLF together with Eric Groft. It is Victor Stanley's pleasure to host this third part of TCLF's Race and Space Conversations. I want to go over some housekeeping before we get started. From attending the Race and Space Conversation webinar today, you're able to get 1.5 CEUs. In order to receive them, you do have to complete the quiz. Depending on your browser, when the webinar started, you should have a quiz pop up. And if you did not have that, then you can check the chat box and we will post a link throughout the webinar. We at Victor Stanley are the ones who receive the quizzes and make the certificates in-house. And with an unusually high number of attendees today, we ask that you please be patient with us and allow around 3 weeks for us to get everything together and created so we can send them out. If you would like to submit questions throughout the webinars, please do so in the Q&A tab and not the chat. The chat box can be used to post thoughts, comments, and say hi throughout the webinar, but the Q&A tab will be monitored by us to talk about at the end. If you have any questions about your certificate, please email us at learning@victorstanley.com. This is being recorded and will be available on our website under our Learning tab on demand in a few days, as well as on TCLF's YouTube. I am grateful for Charles, this outstanding panel, and the TCLF team for presenting on this very important topic. This series is educational and thought-provoking, and much like all of TCLF's programs. It is with great pleasure that I introduce a dear colleague and friend, Charles Birnbaum, President and founder of TCLF.
Thank you, Emma, and thank you to Eileen Berenger, who has been working with Celia Carnes behind the scene to make today possible. Thank you also to all of you for joining us for this third conversation in our ongoing series of Race and Space Conversations, which is part of a broader initiative here at the Cultural Landscape Foundation across all of our programs since we began our Race and Space initiative in 2020. This event today would not be possible without the support of Victor Stanley and TCLF board member Emma Skalka. So thank you to all of you at Victor Stanley. We're also extremely fortunate to have as participants 4 people with extraordinary professional and personal experiences in what I expect will be a rich, provocative, and insightful conversation about memorials and commemoration. I'm especially grateful to James Russell for agreeing to moderate today's program. Over the years, James has written numerous thoughtful and probing articles about memorials, and he is well known for his cogent and distinguished body of architectural criticism, reporting, and analysis. He's joined by our panelists, Justin Garrett Moore, Jha D Amazi, and Peggy King Jorde. Memorials and commemoration are integral to cultural landscapes, and I've been eager for an opportunity to explore this topic. How do cultural landscapes shape our public memory, and how do design decisions affect the process of commemoration? We should keep in mind that this conversation is happening as we're having a national reckoning about memorials to the Confederacy and slaveholders, which are being taken down in city parks, university campuses, and elsewhere. In preparing these remarks, I came across a rather striking characterization of memorials. They are, quote, democratic acts of unforgetting. This quote is from the artist Isamu Noguchi. You can find it in an extensive and compelling article by Spencer Bailey about the artist on the Noguchi Museum's website. Unforgetting can be empowering, debilitating, cathartic, revelatory, reparative. There are so many implications of unforgetting. When creating or conserving memorial landscapes, what aesthetic, historic, cultural, social, and political issues are artists, designers, activists, historians, witnesses, communities, and other stakeholders navigating? Here's a compelling example. In Richmond, Virginia, we're seeing an unforgetting of the Shockoe Hill African Burial Ground. In the 19th century, it was the nation's largest burial site for freed and enslaved African Americans, with more than 22,000 internments. It's one of the sites featured in our thematic landslide report and exhibition from 2021. Today, it's unrecognizable, a palimpsest of abuse. But one descendant, Lenora McQueen, is making it visible, and thanks to a broad coalition of advocates and stakeholders, it was recently listed in the National Register of Historic Places. However, there remains plans to put high-speed rails through remnants of the site. This issue of commemoration in a site, as rich, messy, complicated, abused, and memory-laden as Shockoe, raises a whole host of questions. One of the foundational questions, something that Justin mentioned in a call we had just a few weeks ago, is what makes a history or a place significant or not? He's right. Who gets to decide? What are the roles and functions of memorials? In an interview with Bill Moyer some 20 years ago, Maya Lin said, their function isn't like a physical function, like a house is to shelter you. It's very conceptual, symbolic function. Where should they go? What about a site's carrying capacity based on what happened there, those affected in the community, the location's spatial or design integrity, the authenticity and condition of extant fabric? For example, has the site suffered from purposeful erasure? And what about its setting? All these elements can elevate and frame our individual and collective engagements and experiences. This power of place, to cite Dolores Hayden's groundbreaking book title of 1997, is at the core of a cultural landscape. Hayden talks about new models of collaborations between professionals and communities, as well as new alliances among practitioners concerned with urban landscape history. She notes, artists and designers are also active in the public work of connecting memory into the built fabric of the city. Their interventions in the urban landscape can strengthen urban storytelling and enhance citizens' interest in history. Is this what anchors a pilgrimage site like the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama? What makes for an apt memorial? The former LA Times critic, Christopher Hawthorne, offered this cautionary lament. These days, we see the symbolic shorthand that art and architecture have always relied on to deal with violence and tragedy as wildly insufficient. Instead, we've embraced some crowd-pleasing mixture of authenticity, easily digested narrative, and insta-history. We want to see and touch the real thing. We want somebody to explain to us what the real thing means. Lastly, what about the role of technology? Just last night, during a program on ethics and public art, Justin talked about Kinfolk, an intriguing project of an organization called Movers and Shakers that developed an augmented reality set of monuments. How do these witnesses to history make visible the stories and forge human connections to reveal a site's power of place? Let me close with a remark from Peggy, whose website says, "It matters how we choose to remember." I asked her what she meant by that. She said, "As we live and breathe, so we remember." How we remember our forebears matters because their lives and legacy matter. We are their unfinished business. With that, let's get on to this unfinished business. James?
Thank you, Charles. I'm really honored to host today's exploration of cultural landscapes that shape memory and express values. So thanks to you and the Cultural Landscape Foundation. I happen to live next to Riverside Drive, where Frederick Law Olmsted created many opportunities to erect statues and monuments. They commemorate soldiers, sailors, firefighters, and a variety of luminaries, some forgotten. No one is depicted who is non-white, and only two women, Joan of Arc and Eleanor Roosevelt, who is a recent addition. America enthusiastically, even obsessively, builds memorials to new horrors, causes, and heroes. The extraordinary trio we have with us today will consider how the sometimes contentious memorial sausage gets made, and how we can think more expansively to develop commemorative places and artworks that are more powerful, enduring, and inclusive than the stiff figures atop pedestals and rearing horses on Riverside Drive. Too often, the memorializing object itself gets lost in the political shuffle, in part because politicians rarely have any idea what art and architecture can do, but also because public discourse lacks a language to capture our values and expectations about such public art. Let me introduce our panel, who will make brief remarks before we begin our conversation about the thorny issues and expansive possibilities. I'll say just a little about them now. The full bios are in the announcement for this panel. Peggy King Jorde is a cultural projects consultant whose work in this area includes serving under 3 New York City mayors, where she provided oversight to cultural landmarks, public art, and museums. She has developed a special expertise in burial grounds that have been neglected or threatened, where the fundamental respect our society is supposed to accord to the dead has too often been denied to Black people, whether enslaved or not. Her work is both physically and socially reparative, using archaeological tools and research to help identify remains and link them to descendants and descendant communities. She has worked across the US and in the British Overseas Territory of St. Helena. Jha D Amazi is the director of the Public Memory and Memorials Lab at the Mass Design Group, a brilliant Boston-based nonprofit. Does anyone else in America have such a job title? The work of Mass covers an extraordinary range, from award-winning community centers to transformative projects in some of the most needy regions of the world. The work includes the extraordinary National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama, that takes on both slavery and lynching, and The Embrace with artist Hank Willis Thomas on the 1965 Freedom Plaza on the Boston Commons. Jha D has worked on the Gun Violence Memorial Project and on newer initiatives that we'll hear something about today. Outside of architecture, Jha D is a spoken word artist and space maker for LGBTQ+ communities of color. Justin Garrett Moore is the inaugural program officer for Humanities in Place, a new, truly innovative initiative of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. There he uses his extensive experience as an urban designer and city planner to identify overlooked landscapes, places, and people, and help communities create organizations with the capacity to restore these physical legacies, interpret their importance, and have program activities that help these communities thrive. Many of these include elements of commemoration and memorialization. Justin can also draw on his experience in design review as the former executive director of New York City's Public Design Commission. I want to quickly flip through some images to remind the audience and our panel, just sharing here. And I hope that's displaying properly. About some of the many issues that need to be engaged around the making of memorials. So Vietnam, this is of course the memorial that kindled the contemporary appetite for commemoration. Abstract, it became a unifying force by focusing on the names of Americans who died in a very unpopular war. The Boston Marathon bombing, almost every tragic event attracts this kind of spontaneous expression of grief. There's often an urge to translate this grief into permanent form, but the risk of irrelevance is high, and emotions fade and people move on. The 9/11 Memorial and Museum was an enormously difficult project to realize because it has been so difficult for Americans to engage with its complicity with historical forces that produced radicalization and the consequences of America's response to the terror attacks. This grandiose, though powerful 8-acre memorial could only recognize the victims. Even so, it took 18 months of emotional consultation just to decide how to display their names. The African Burial Ground National Monument, I think, was the first time rediscovered remains of thousands of early Black New Yorkers, enslaved and free, were treated with respect that we usually accord to the dead when encountered in the excavation of a federal office building. I think a lot of people at the time did not recognize the reparative importance of these remains and the necessity of the remaining in situ. The National Museum of African American History and Culture, the building's power derives in part from its prominent place on the National Mall. Interest groups are very aware of the hierarchy of location in relationship to what is known as the monumental core in Washington. And the competition for prominence sites can become a little unseemly. Though not a memorial per se, though it has a beautifully contemplative memorial space inside, its founding director, Lonnie Bunch, told me that it was essential to tell the stories of slavery and Jim Crow through artifacts as an authentic and perpetual refutation of those who try to soften or rationalize the cruelties of this history. In this way, the museum shares an agenda with the Holocaust Memorial Museum on the Mall and similar commemorations whose message is never again. This large sculpture of Harriet Tubman commands a public plaza, and with the figure in unstoppable motion, declares her determination and the urgency of her work, helping enslaved people achieve freedom. For communities that have long been neglected in public art, representation of the subject in figurative art, it seems to be essential, but it's not easy. Artistic and design questions can be particularly fraught. Sometimes the competing interests and a complex approval process can reduce public art to a kind of artistic camel or a work so broadly acceptable that it sinks to the merely decorative. Civic wallpaper that evokes no feelings and no curiosity. Oh, this is just another Harriet. Community stakeholders may be looking for imagery of optimism and empowerment, like Alison Saar's Tubman sculpture, and like this work, which is on temporary display in Madison Park, though it is not a commemoration per se. In this work, there are references to idealized traditions of monumental grandeur and power, as well as contemporary imagery similar to Saar's in this proposal to replace a statue to Marion Sims that was removed from Central Park. Brick House, to me, has a strong evocative power, especially when it was in this perfect, if temporary, position on the High Line in New York. A bust atop an evocation of a traditional African house, it is an image that forces the viewer to ask questions, to wonder what she's about and who she is. An image of primordial calm. Her lack of eyes is disturbing, but you want to know what that means and what she seems to be thinking. In a competition to replace the Sims statue I just referenced, an expert panel chose this artist, though not this piece, which created an uproar among non-experts involved in the selection who preferred the idealized representation by Bagwell. So these are just a quick path through the perils and possibilities of public art. So let's start our panel. Justin, I think you're on first.
Great, thank you, James, and really happy to be a part of this conversation. So let me share screen. As was mentioned, I'm now with the Mellon Foundation, where we have a $250 million initiative called the Monuments Project. So monuments and memorials, which are the statues, the plaques, markers, place names, artwork that commemorate our people and events, are how our country tells and teaches its story. So what does the story of the American commemorative landscape tell us? Who are we instructed to honor and uplift? Who do we see or not see in our public spaces and the symbols that adorn them? Does the civic landscape show an accurate picture of our nation or propagate a woefully inaccurate story? So today, our public realm disproportionately celebrates a limited few and overlooks the multitudes who have made and shaped our society and have limited our understanding of our collective history. And this is something that work at the Mellon Foundation funded with the Monument Lab through their National Monument Audit found this information, right? It's in the data, it's not a perception. This is information that you can go and it's objectively known that our commemorative landscape is telling an incomplete story and is privileging an overwhelmingly white and overwhelmingly male picture of our public landscape. And that is a demonstration of power historically, but also as it sits with us today. And the idea of how we deal with our commemorative landscape is not new. So the first recorded removal of a monument in the United States was in 1776. And we all know when the United States began. So that very same year, July 9th, 1776, this statue of King George III of England in Bowling Green in New York City was taken down by members of the new American nation, right? So what we would today call patriots were people who were doing things like taking down monuments against powers who didn't reflect their identity and liberties and experiences. But this is continuing to today. So in places like Richmond, I think Charles mentioned this in his introduction, Richmond, the former capital of the Confederacy, was a site that had been completely marked by this idea of an inaccurate history, such as the Robert E. Lee monument that during the 2020 protests became an important site and a remarking by the people of what it meant to change and challenge the commemorative landscape. And this monument by now has finally been removed. And in fact, most recently, the Mellon Foundation supported an $11 million commitment to the city of Richmond as they looked at remaking and reshaping their commemorative landscape. This is an image of a train shed in Shockoe Bottom. Charles mentioned the important site known for its connections to the history of slavery, not only for Richmond, but really for the entire United States, and to fully commemorate the history of slavery in Richmond and in America. And so at this site, we'll support the transformation of what was once this train shed to become a space for learning, for reinterpretation, for engagement, for difficult and challenging conversations. So perhaps not replacing a statue, right, the man on the horse, for another statue in a different form and with a different subject, but in fact, a monument may be simply creating spaces for reconsideration, repair, engagement, and care in different ways. And so we're really proud of this work, which engaged multiple stakeholders and actors, engaged the city government, and engaged community advocates, but also people within the existing power structures to create a different type of commemorative space. And so in our work in the Monuments Project, we've been acknowledging that there are different types of work, right? There are different types of work to create our current commemorative landscapes, and there will need to be different types of work to rethink and reshape and reimagine our commemorative landscape. And so while, of course, there are things like new monuments that may be commissioned and in kind of the conventional and innovative forms, there also needs to be the work of contextualization and education. There may need to be acts of removal or recontextualization or repair. But there also needs to be scholarship and research, right? The work of finding histories that haven't been fully documented or elevated, but also doing the storytelling work to reinterpret and re-engage communities in broader ways, to have the multitude be reflected in our histories, but also to have the multitude have voice, power, and agency in the shaping of our landscapes. And finally, there's a whole set of strategies around research, both around content, but also about practices and policies that must be engaged in the work, like the National Monument Audit that I mentioned earlier. And so just wanted to share very quickly, I will try to share very quickly, a set of examples. So one that was mentioned already was Kinfolk by Movers and Shakers. This was a group that came together as, frankly, a group of activists thinking about public space and around spaces like Columbus Circle. So in New York City, the famous monument to Christopher Columbus on 59th in Central Park West, but rethinking that, how that gets remade without necessarily removing that monument. And so the idea of augmented reality applications were a way to do that through emotive activism. But going beyond that, there is research and contextualization and education, and I'll share a brief clip that talks about that.
2021, it's no
Can
secret
people hear
that
the sound?
tattoos, money, even our textbooks have one thing in common. They're full of white male slave holders. Movers and Shakers is launching Kinfold, a free app featuring augmented reality monuments of Black and brown figures we should have learned about in school. We partnered with Netflix to include 4 figures featured in the Main the Fight for America, a docuseries that explores the legacy of the 14th Amendment. Now, the whole family can come together and bring monuments into your living room. You can make them life-size, read their bios, and discover hidden gems through our Kinfolk web archive. Download today in your app store.
Right, so this is using the power of technology to not only create the monument, to create the kind of the public interface, but also to give people access to a deeper archive, right? The primary source research. Right? You can go and download the app and bring the young lords into your living room or onto your street corner, but then access the articles that tell you in a deep way about what happened in that space through the new medium. But we're also looking at other kind of modes and conventions of practice and thinking about ways that aren't the colonial model or the kind of the conventions that power structures have demanded. So for example, the Alaska Heritage Institute, which is an indigenous group, and it's actually a for-profit corporation of indigenous peoples in Alaska that have done the work of not only stewarding their own community development, economic empowerment, but also holding and protecting their cultural heritage and their memories in space. And so we supported this incredible project to create a totem pole trail in Juneau along its waterfront, where Alaska Heritage is working with members of the tribe to hold their conventional practices in carving the totems, and we'll be installing those in the public realm and public landscape. So connecting the history and the regional cultures and bringing them into public space by maintaining these practices and documenting it for future generations. Another form that our work is engaged is thinking about the different forms of commemoration. So again, beyond the conventional or permanent or fixed monument. And so thinking about temporary and ephemeral commemoration is quite important. So we've been working with the Trust for the National Mall and the National Capital Planning Commission around their Beyond Granite initiative, which is to think about our commemorative landscape and including in the monumental core of Washington, D.C., about how other models can work. And so the names quilt, also known as the AIDS quilt, is obviously an important example of that to show that there are different ways that we can hold space and hold memory beyond conventional forms. And this is something that we've seen can be reinvented and reimagined, such as when there was the temporary memorial to COVID-19, marking the moment when at that point there had been 400,000 people lost with the lanterns at the reflecting pole. But also not only stories of loss or harm or trauma, but also stories of triumph and accomplishment and collectiveness, like this commemoration of the Apollo 11 mission, where there's a projection onto the Washington Monument of that unique accomplishment. And the last example I wanted to show is thinking about the role of artists and designers and kind of practice. And so this is in Memphis, in a place called Tom Lee Park, which honors Tom Lee. He was an African-American river worker who in 1925 rescued 32 white engineers and their families from drowning on a steamboat in the Mississippi River. And so Tom Lee was this figure that was commemorated kind of as a heroic figure in Memphis, which is challenged by a number of kind of racial tensions that exist to this day. But the memorial had some challenges, and there was a removal of a problematic obelisk from the park. And so there's an opportunity to rethink that landscape and commemorative landscape. And so the artist, Theaster Gates, working with Scape landscape architects, designed an anti-monument, sort of a counter to conventional monuments, which is to provide spaces for engagement and collection and opportunity for people from different backgrounds in Memphis to come together in a public space, in a public realm, and question their relationships to one another, to stories, to narrative, to the river, and to place in ways that can evolve over time in a number of kind of performative marches, ceremonies, exchanges, but also the importance of what it simply means to be in everyday life together and in an important public space. So I'll leave it there and look forward to the conversation.
I think Peggy, you're up next.
Thank you. Over the 30 plus years since my work began on the New York African Burial Ground, I've developed a multidisciplinary consulting practice, often working in the field with a variety of stakeholders and marginalized communities in the US and globally. Often challenging and sometimes confrontational, the nature of my work can be akin to that of a repo man, one who comes calling to reclaim, and in this case, cultural assets that have been long in the possession of others who refuse to understand that ownership was never theirs and that a debt of reparative justice is still owed. Next slide, please. With the rediscovery of the African burial ground in New York City, many lessons were learned and myths, past and present, debunked. Construction workers did not accidentally dig up human remains, but in truth, the burial ground was well documented in an environmental impact statement paid for by the American people, advising a federal agency of the potential for its historical significance. We learned that just months before the installation of New York's first African-American mayor, and despite the community board approving a resolution requiring the federal agency to comply with the Uniform Land Use Review procedure, the federal agency and the city agreed to a friendly condemnation of the site as a way to avoid reviews by planning authorities who could protect the site. The project was described as the largest civilian development undertaking at the cost of $500 million, which could be accelerated with little or no hindrance by the public process. Next slide. Despite the project's history of attempts to obscure, erase, or render irrelevant the memory, lives, and history unfolding at a burial ground for enslaved and free Blacks, this was about my community, my history, and it mattered who would tell their story. A groundswell of support would be needed from a community of stakeholders who understood the meaning of what it was or what was to be achieved. So I worked with others within and outside of City Hall to galvanize preservation and community advocates, solicit the support of political leaders, government agencies, and influencers to dismantle the obstacles that plagued the project from the start. And it took an act of Congress to halt construction and begin the process of reclamation and remembrance. The bedrock of the memory work tied to the New York African Burial Ground was its meaningful community engagement and consent. The engagement process was vigorous and vital to ensuring the respectful retrieval and treatment of ancestral remains in the field and over the course of the scientific research at Howard Universities. And when I talk about community engagement, I'm not only talking about public meetings, I'm talking about members sitting on the Federal Steering Committee, helping to construct the plan for memorialization that went to Congress, as well as the carvings of the coffins that you see on the lower left that were part of the reinterment. And then a larger process of reinterment, the procession, horse-drawn carriages up Broadway, which is usually known as the Canyon of Heroes during ticker tape parades, and that it mattered to the community that that happened. Memorialization, the engagement or African-American leadership in research, public dissemination of information, the memorial design, interpretation, and reinterment was critical. It was critical to how we would tell the story today. It was critical to have archaeologists in the field handling remains and cultural resources because they are the interpreters of our story. Memorialization required artists and architects to demonstrate an authentic understanding of the significance. Next slide, please. Public art and the historic designation of a 5-block radius guarded against future development threats. Bronze sidewalk medallions sharing the site's history and the iconic Triumph of the Human Spirit by Lorenzo Pace soars at the foot of the Supreme Courthouse steps. Next slide. Art installations were integrated into the building floors, walls, and facades, having permanence, intending to reshape the nation's consciousness around the truth of slavery. This is the lobby area of 290 Broadway, the building that displaced 400 remains that are reinterred at the site. Next slide, please. We redefine spaces for engagement, reflection, and work. The success of the New York African Burial Ground ignited a movement towards preservation equity and awareness, meaningful public engagement, the development of a more informed curricula with the promise of truth-telling and repair. This is the inaugural ancestor feast, and this was the first time a few years ago that this happened. Generally, the federal GSA really did not encourage major events like this in the rotunda. And it was important to the descendant community that we occupy the space and that we remind people of where they are walking and where this building sits. Next slide, please. Slavery was not an isolated affair. So connecting the global narrative happened for me in 2016, when I was called to work with stakeholders advocating for the preservation of a burial site on St. Helena, a British territory in the South Atlantic, a Middle Passage site for more than 8,000 burials of enslaved Africans retrieved from slave ships bound for the Americas, 325 burials unearthed and stored for more than a decade in a prison storage room. Next slide, please. Taking our campaign off island and to Britain's halls and Parliament and the United Nations were necessary steps to building global alliances and awareness around remembrance and repair. Next slide. With the release of a documentary about the site at the Tribeca Film Festival last June, for which I'm a producer and subject, we launched an impact campaign that aims to reclaim the integrity of Rupert's Valley as one of the most significant traces of the Middle Passage leg of the transatlantic slave trade. A port development and container park threaten the site. The project also has precipitated an African burial ground alliance with the Dutch Caribbean island, St. Eustatius, for which I'm a government advisory committee appointee and consultant on the burial site preservation. The burial site on St. Helena is in a valley called Rupert's Valley. In the upper center picture, that is a prison storeroom where remains when a service road cut through the valley from the new airport that was built, and it displaced 325 remains, which were stored in this prison storeroom for more than a decade. And what is still planned for the valley is the container part And this was as a part of our campaign to imagine these containers stacked, and the stone wall that encloses them actually was built by these enslaved individuals who built the wall for a garden. It was a garden that they were restricted to the valley and could not leave the valley, and it was essentially considered a depot until such time these Africans, either they were called liberated Africans, but they went on, none are recorded as being returned to Africa, but in fact were shipped on to other British territories, British islands, where they lived out their lives. And about 500 of the liberated, so-called liberated Africans remained on the island in a marginalized community. Next slide. And finally, one of the other projects I'm bringing you back to the US, the New York burial ground, African burial ground lessons that were learned weren't lost actually on a New York housing and nonprofit organization developer after they were advanced plans to purchase a lot. And this is a lot to build a high quality shelter for people experiencing homelessness and marginalization. The site was an auto repair shop, but research revealed it was part of a cemetery for enslaved African people under the Dutch in New York. Working with community stakeholders, we held numerous, and this is during COVID, so numerous online community outreach, listening sessions, not only with the broader, the community in which this site actually exists, but the broader New York community, as well as potential clients of this center. And so working with these stakeholders, we put together an advisory group, which is, any of the input is not limited to this advisory group, but working with this advisory group, I put together a visioning portal, which the group fed their ideas about how they felt they wanted the site to have a presence in the community. Because the site also had older Native American ceremonial sites, we also included and reached out to the Native American, the Lenape community to participate in this process, and put together a design team who was working on studying these various designs still under development. But this is a small site, and it's really unique because the developer actually, who had worked in the mayor's office, was aware of the African burial ground. And so the lessons learned weren't lost on him. And I joined this project to help walk them through just a lot of the considerations. With that, if there are any more questions about it, I'm happy to answer those questions during the Q&A. Thank you.
Well, thanks for that. And there is a little Q&A box that you can put your questions in, and I will try and get to some of them. Maybe some of them, I see one already that speaks to a point I wanted to make anyway, so so that's good. So Jha D, you are on.
Thank you all so much for being here. I am truly honored to be amongst these folks and in this conversation. And so I will share with you all a little bit about the Public Memory and Memorials Lab. Unfortunately, there's never enough time to provide a full overview, so I certainly do welcome questions if there are any specifically to what it is that I shared. But I think we all understand, especially just based off of what we've already heard today, that worldwide memory and history in built form, whether it's through memorials, monuments, street names, or family homes even, carry a responsibility to communicate complex histories and provide spaces for truth-telling. And built in them is the power to remind us about who we once were so that we may understand who we are and then decide who we want to become. And you all heard Justin Garrett Moore refer earlier to the Monument Lab, but in 2021, they published the National Monument Audit of nearly 50,000 monuments with several key findings. But one of those key findings that really kind of inspired our work is the one that the story of the United States as told by our current monuments really truly misrepresents our history. And so to that point, the work in our lab then is asking questions around how can spatializing memory inspire collective action for generations to come? How can our public realm be reimagined to celebrate the multitudes of those who have shaped our society and expand our understanding of collective history? And in that, more importantly, how can we broaden the narratives of whose stories are being told in our public landscape while we consider, of course, whose stories are being left out? And so this portfolio of work that I have the opportunity to lead and to work in began with our work at the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, designed in collaboration with Brian Stevenson and the Equal Justice Initiative. This 6-acre site is the first national memorial to victims of lynching and provides space for truth-telling, hope, healing, and reconciliation. The work has been acknowledged for both the beauty of its architecture, but more importantly, the depth of the meaning of place and purpose, as well as celebrated for the ways in which it is both catalytic and perhaps cathartic. And when I say cathartic, I'm referencing the work that we did prior to the design of the actual memorial that folks see on site today. And so our work there began with the Equal Justice Initiative in designing an engagement strategy and a process of soil collecting, drawing active connections to unmarked sites and spaces of terror in order to reclaim those spaces for the historical record and thereby spatializing their memory. And so we invited community members, students, family members of lynching victims and others to collect soil from known sites of lynchings throughout the state of Alabama. And those jars are now exhibited at the Legacy Museum. These exhibits express our ongoing commitment, our meaning the project work's commitment to confronting our histories of racial injustice. And in the spirit of commitment, I also want to share another project that we're working on with you all, and that is in Sugar Land, Texas, with the Fort Bend Independent School District to honor the Sugar Land 95. During the 2018 construction of the James Reese Technical Center, the remains of 95 individuals who were victims of cognitive leasing were discovered. And after those remains were reinterred, the site was then designated as a historical cemetery in 2021. Our work began with the Fort Bend Independent School District in October of 2020, and we've had a series of engagement conversations with the local community, the school district, and others. And throughout that engagement, we heard that the cemetery, amongst other things, should be a place for reflection and celebration. And this led us to be inspired by a homegoing. Some believed that death meant freedom for those who were enslaved or victims of forced labor. So the site becomes a celebration of that freedom from oppression and the injustices that were suffered, because we now know with the discovery that the Sugar Land 95 were not afforded the dignity of a homegoing. So the emotional journey of the site begins then with the wake, which is the acceptance of the loss, personal moment to be with the deceased and to reflect on their lives. Next is the service, the remembrance of the deceased, and the emotional expression through song, dance, shouting, of course, and a eulogy to the person's life and importance. Thirdly, we have the procession, where participants are invited to attend the homegoing journey together to bury their loved one at the gravesite. It is also a moment to exchange stories of their loved ones. And ultimately, the repast, the feast and fellowship that follows the burial. So our site then is organized around this notion of a homegoing, this homage, and it is designed to foster lifelong learning and compassionate citizenship by way of this emotional journey. The site will facilitate educational programming through culturally relevant curriculum and instructional resources. It'll increase awareness and an understanding of the site's historic significance while identifying and engaging descendant communities, which will be an ongoing process, and provide opportunities that allow for the community to be involved in formal acts of acknowledgement and remembrance. Ultimately, the memorial site will support historic preservation of the cemetery and the surrounding lands to serve as cultural resources in our community while providing and modeling care for others, inclusivity, and cultural awareness. The last project that I want to share with you all is the recently unveiled Embrace here in Boston. And as I talked about earlier, the thesis of the lab is to expand narratives in the public realm. And so you can imagine that there's certainly a number of projects that are rooted in this wrought traumatic history that a number of communities, particularly the Black community, has experienced in this country. But there's also an opportunity to honor and memorialize joy, and in this case, particularly Black joy. And so we worked with the artist Hank Willis Thomas on this design competition launched by Embrace Boston, an organization here that wanted to honor and acknowledge the Kings, Coretta Scott King and Martin Luther King. And Hank was inspired by the love of the Kings, a love that he says fueled the civil rights movement. And in his piece, he references this particular photo on the left of the Kings locked in a celebratory embrace after MLK finds out that he is going to be a recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize. The call for the design competition was to create a memorial that honored both Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King. And it was an opportunity to celebrate how they lived in, loved on, and ultimately touched this city. So in concert with the sculpture, Mass Design Group worked with Hank to create the 1965 Freedom Plaza that uplifts the names of 65 local civil rights activists and leaders. And in this way, it was an opportunity for the project to move from what we typically see in monuments and memorials as singular hero worship to instead a desire to actually honor and uplift collective action and referencing the work of local leaders and local activists. Already, the site has become a place for gathering, convening, and demonstration, including the recent protests that took place after the murder of Tyree Nichols. And so we're starting immediately to see how this particular site is a place of reckoning here in the city of Boston. And coupled with the memorial is the second phase of work, which will be the Embrace Center that will sit at the heart of Roxbury and support Embrace Boston's mission to be working at the intersection of arts, culture, community, and research to ultimately dismantle structural racism. And so it's an opportunity for us to have a conversation about how a lot of these memorial projects that we're working in need to be coupled by these opportunities for ongoing education, research, and reference. And so I will stop there because my understanding was that I had just a brief moment of time, but please do ask any questions that folks might have. And if there are projects that you are aware of in the lab that I did not touch on today, I'd be happy to answer any questions about them.
Thank you, Jha. And yes, there is a Q&A box in your Zoom, so you can put some questions in there. I think when I looked at sort of how people were speaking and the kind of issues they were raising, I think there's really quite a few that are common. And I'm just trying to get something to scroll here. It's not happening. Maybe the place to begin is with stakeholders, because I think that's been brought up by all three of the speakers, and how in your various endeavors you involve stakeholders. I mean, my first question, which Peggy, about stakeholders, has already partly answered, is like, how do you deal with this in a burial ground where the remains may be very disconnected from the stakeholders, but also in things like the Monuments Project, you're doing this audit, but also, again, how do you get the information of the audit? How do you find the people who know about these things? And even the work, I guess the work also on the 95, how that, process of discovery maybe took place, especially so many of these burial sites are kind of, oh, surprise, there are remains here. So maybe if each of you might just give a little perspective on that, the issue of how you find people and how you involve people.
Yeah, I can start things off a little bit there. So in our work at Mellon, we've attempted to have a conversation about shifts in power and access. So most of our commemorative landscape has been made by people in some form of power or agency or resource, right? A group of people decide a person or a figure or event is important. They exercise their political and economic power to make something happen, right? And so the unevenness of our commemorative landscape reflects that. So in our work with the Monuments Project, we've intentionally made our processes more open. So, you can go to the website and submit your idea. Believe it or not, it takes us some time, but believe it or not, we read every submission and consider a much wider range of people who are looking to mark their histories or tell their stories or have their sites and places get the resources to be marked for history and for the public, right? So it's not only people that can put together a campaign and raise money and lobby in Washington that are able to access some of our resources. So that's something that we've been doing intentionally. It's not perfect, right? You still have to have the internet to go, to go on a website and submit a submission. But it is something that you have to actively think about. How do you reach more people, and how do you actively look for the stories and narratives and communities that haven't had access to have their history be made public and to be made accessible. So that's one dimension. I think the other dimension, and this is something that Peggy brought up, is being critical about these terms like engagement. What does that mean exactly? And that there are many different modes and ways that people can be involved, and to have agency in how spaces are made or maintained or shifted. Another project that we supported was the North Carolina Freedom Monument. And this is something that people, back to John Hope Franklin, have been working on for decades, right? To kind of have their stories and their history marked in public. And so there are some things that are slow and institutional. We're supporting monuments like doing a thing or doing an event, but we're actually supporting a form of institution building that gets away from engagement, but actually talks about shifting power and not only thinking about stakeholders, but thinking about what are the lasting infrastructures for memory that we have in this country, and who gets to participate in it. So it has to be an intentional act.
Thank you, Justin. Just piggybacking on some of that, when I am faced with that question, I think about, I share that every community that I go to, there's a community in Noonan, Georgia, which is just south of Atlanta, and a cemetery there, and how that community deals with galvanizing this groundswell of community involvement. With the African burial ground, people sometimes think that an article appeared in the paper and everybody came running, and that's not what happened. I mean, things were happening behind the city walls. We were working on it, and there'd be a little appearance of an article, and there was no groundswell. And it really took going in and thinking strategically about who in the community, whether they were a political leader, whether they were an educator, who do you go to sit with to say, this is important, how can we get the attention of the broader community? And it's not that there was a lack of interest, it's just that you're competing with a lot of other issues in people's lives. And so, even more recently, there is a project on Staten Island, a cemetery, a project that I'm working on. And some of the community folks who really started working on this, a filmmaker actually, Heather Quinlan, who has been documenting this indicated that, hey, Peggy, it doesn't seem like everybody, there's this groundswell, it's so hard. And what I find is that you really do have to go as a consultant into the community to find out what's most important to them, just culturally. And then you have to get creative with how you tap into that. That's what I mean by an authentic understanding, engaging as a designer, as a consultant, authentically for that community and tapping into what is important to that community, because they'll approach it differently.
Yeah, I would add to that some of the ways in which we're thinking about our work at Mass is, yes, about building stakeholders and engaging folks, but it's also about creating opportunities for stewardship, right? Because ultimately, the project has to have anchors, has to have stewards, has to have champions that are invested in this work, that want to see this work continue, that want to evolve what the project can actually do 10, 15, 50 years from now, right? And so how does the design process and the ways in which we as artists and intellectuals and et cetera typically work, how does that create opportunity to engage folks in a way that then gives them the ownership that they ultimately need over the work, over the project? And so when you asked the question, James, about like the 95, for example, I didn't have enough time to talk about how, similarly to what you just said, Peggy, that there was years, decades of work and research that preceded the discovery, if you will. And there was a gentleman, Reginald Moore, who had been shouting to the top of his lungs in Sugar Land about how this cemetery or cemeteries like this very likely had to exist, given some of the history and the context that he was already aware of. And so the project then launched from this set of research that had already existed, right? And I don't think that had it not been for Reginald Moore in this decade of material and activism that he's been building on, that the project would have been able to that it has been. And his organization and the folks that he worked with, he has since passed, are now leading a lot of the conversations around community engagement. And so we, as the architects and the designers, yes, we are working with the school district, yes, we are contracted to them, but ultimately we are working in service of the story. We are working in service of the community that is present on the ground. So we are not necessarily creating stakeholders. We are responding to those who have already identified themselves, as such. Another example that I'll give is the Embrace Boston work, and I'll do this quickly. That was a design competition that then had a year and a half of engagement throughout the city of Boston. So Embrace Boston posted surveys, design boards, asked for questions, and et cetera, all across the city. Boston Public Libraries, post offices, other places where we could find people. We had to go to the community. We could not expect the community to come to the Boston Foundation or to come to the offices of the Embrace Boston, right? Like that was not going to be a productive, fruitful conversation. We had to meet people where they were, where they are, to ask the questions relative to this particular memorial. And so I say all of that to say, I think it depends on the project, how one identifies the opportunities and resources for stakeholder engagement, but ultimately the work should be building stewards of the story and of the project.
Well, that's really fascinating. Part of like, how do we be authentic? How do we be true to the resources that maybe we're encountering? I assume no one taught you anything about this in design school, Jha. So how did you come around to this, to get this, you end up with this very unique position that you now hold? And any of the other panels that want to share their experiences on this too.
Yeah, no, definitely was not taught how to do any of this in grad school. Thank you very much, education. But certainly was able to come to this work with a little bit of lived experiences. You referenced in my bio that I'm a spoken word artist, which ultimately means I'm a storyteller, which is exactly what I'm doing here through architecture and memorialization, right? It's a different branch of storytelling. But what I would say is the ways in which I am learning, not that I've been taught, but I am actively learning how to do this quote unquote work is by way of our project partners. I am overwhelmed with the opportunity that I get to sit in the room with folks like Brian Stevenson, EJI. I didn't get a chance to talk about the More Up project, but Michelle Browder, sitting with Amari Parish Jeffries from Embrace Boston, Hank Willis Thomas, et cetera, being, again, in collaboration with and in service with so many of these vibrant, determined, relentless project partners who know the story that needs to be told. They know how they want to tell it. I am just simply providing a tool and a resource by which to do that. Not simply, I'm not trying to undermine the work that I do, but it is not about how did I learn how to do this so much it is, as it is for me, how can I continue to be inspired by and informed by individuals, organizations who have identified an important story that needs to be told to reveal histories that are critical to their communities, to my communities, to our communities, and how can I learn how to interpret the information, the wealth of information that they're already bringing to the table. So in that way, I would say that I'm learning simply by being a good listener and therefore being a good steward of what I am being offered by way of our partnership.
So much of this conversation has not been about statues or specific artistic traditions, all the things that, you know, maybe artists and architects talk about among themselves in these questions. But because, I mean, one of the reasons I juxtapose Vivian Bagwell and Simone Lee is, you know, they both were very sincere. I mean, I've never seen the Lee, I'm not sure it ever was publicized, but they're really, somehow we got into this whole thing about a style argument. And what I'm looking for maybe, and it's just your whole processes, I think, are probably revealing different ways to get out from under these. I should say Simone just withdrew. She said, I'm not, you know, if everybody really wants somebody else, that's fine, which I thought was, you know, really graceful. But part of it is, you know, somehow these get a little toxic. And so maybe anything about the way you folks do your work that you'd like to, people who might end up being involved in these, so can kind of avoid the more, I guess, toxic aspects of developing these things, or with, you know, interest groups clashing with each other, et cetera.
Yeah, I'll say, and this is with my old design commission hat on, because we were involved in some of the conversations around the Beyond Sims effort, but it's not only that project, right? This happens all the time with public projects and conversations about community participation and agency. And I think there is, in the case of Sims, a sort of a narrative that I find challenging and problematic, which is, you know, the people, the community isn't aware, understanding, or kind of fully appreciating a certain model or reflection or design or whatever it is, and that there are people that are in a different position that know a better way, and that those two things are in tension. But I think what was lost in the Bagwell and Lee conversation was that there was a process, right? So one of the artists was there in the community doing a lot of work, kind of participation, a lot of engagement. And that design, that approach was put into opposition with something that was kind of, frankly, from the commissioned work, right? The curated commissioned work model, right? And those two forces were put into play, and people then are surprised that the dynamic that had people's actual involvement and participation won. That should not have been a surprise to anyone. It should not have been a problem. It should not have been framed in the ways that it was framed, right? And it's on both sides, right? For the brief, right? For the artist to know there's an expectation that generating this work has a certain level of time and participation. By the way, that takes time, and it takes labor, and it takes work that should be compensated. And artists are never compensated for that, or rarely. Architects are rarely compensated for that, right? The whole system is entirely in order to do work in the ways that we hope and have learned, hopefully, that are important ways for the work to be done ethically and responsibly, inclusively, et cetera, et cetera. So you can't come afterward and say equity, diversity, inclusion, and all of this stuff, but then not actually resource it, right? To not actually talk about the different types of work that need to happen, whether that's research or kind of the soft costs, et cetera. So there, I think that's something that, you know, there's a structural thing that has to happen, that public works in public space, or even private works in public space, have to significantly shift what types of work are resourced, who is resourced to do that work in a way. And that's on the commissioning side. Frankly, it then needs to continue after the thing is built, because maintenance and care is the other dimension of this. So yes, the thing is built, but can it be kept? Can it be maintained? Right? Will it still matter long-term? Is it programmed and activated long-term? So there's a much broader time frame and arc and kind of power dynamic that has to be fully engaged here to respond adequately to that question. Because the moment of the commissioning is a narrow slice, right? 15 different people comes to that meeting, totally different outcome out of a city of 8.5 million. Right. So the arc has to be longer, and kind of the people involved have to be broader.
Any of you others want to add?
No, I totally agree. I totally agree.
I think Justin's been through it a few times.
Multiple times, yeah.
Yeah. I think, and you've mentioned the kind of power dynamic a couple of times, and I always wonder if it's a little inescapable. I mean, it's especially true around the National Mall, where, you know, there's this hierarchy of real estate of, you know, whoever's closer to the, you know, a monumental core, that's the most important place to be. So there's a lot of lobbying. And again, it's something like, can't we undercut this in some fashion or find a way to transcend it, or any bright idea? Because inevitably there are powerful people who will just be able to just bring more resources to the argument. And so how do we, you know, try and deal with that?
I guess I can weigh in again. So the project I shared, and it's called Beyond Granite, if anyone wants to look it up. So this is an effort with the Capital Planning Commission and the Trust for National Mall kind of working together. So, you know, government entity and kind of nonprofit steward entity, and of course with National Parks Service fully engaged to have some difficult conversations. You know, the space conversation, right? There's only so much space on the mall before it becomes completely filled with objects and spaces, and actually creates a dynamic where it's no longer for everyone, because it just becomes so marked and tagged that it actually becomes a space for a lot of different people that happen to exercise their power there. And so, yeah, the project is to say, well, maybe this isn't the only way that we do this anymore, and that we actually need to spend some time and resources and energy to figure out other ways for how we make ourselves and our stories and our histories present on that important national platform, and in that important national place. And so then, you know, the kind of the names quilt, the AIDS quilt, is sort of like the evidence that it is possible and powerful and sustainable. I think so many people connect and relate to that, but that was just one instance, and we have to learn new tools, new strategies, new approaches, and we just have to test it out. right? The obelisk has been around a really long time, right? and at this point, right, the wall with the inscribed name has also been around, and the beautiful landscape has also been around a long time. But we need some new tools, and we have to kind of learn how to do that, and that takes creativity and experimentation. It also takes engagement. So I think it's just start by starting a little bit is I think where folks in government and I think in practice are, because this field has to be developed and built. Mass obviously is a key part of this equation, sort of understanding that we need new and other tools to do this work.
I think Jha is writing me and saying, can you rephrase that question? I guess it is this idea. Well, let me ask another question, then maybe it'll kind of reveal itself, which is that one of the things that I think we see in some of the, I was hearing a radio program the other day where it was a kind of somebody, kind of person on the street interview, like, what do you think a memorial should be? And most of the people were talking about kind of decorative, pleasant to look at, a nice part of the landscape. They wanted it to be kind of idealized and I don't know, uplifting even. We didn't even get as far as that. I thought, well, they're really seeing this as like furniture, or what I call wallpaper. Is that like a non-issue, or are people's expectations sometimes kind of run up against sort of something that's enduring or powerful or really helps you connect with the event, the person, the place?
I think for me, it's a challenge when you're talking about the average Joe on the street and the vocabulary that they have to be able to try and express to you what it is you think, what it is they think they want, versus you as a design professional and you having all these other very, just extensive system and way of looking at things that you sort of see all kinds of things happening. And so to that conversation, those are almost kind of two different conversations, really. It seems the person that you're asking is just limited in terms of their language, but I think it's one of those things where they say, I know it when I see it. You know what I mean? Once something is designed or an idea is developed, they know it when they see it. And then the other thing, listening to these questions, James, that you've raised, there's another facet to how community, or the broader community, I think, comes to some of these, some of the memorials. Sometimes it's just important just to have a memorial. They aren't wrapped up in the design and whether it's whether it really meets whatever this angle or that, whatever that aesthetic is. In the African-American community, oftentimes it's about, well, we got something, we have something. And I don't mean to make it sound as if, it's shallow, but when you talk about our not seeing ourselves in the environment, sometimes it's about, well, we'll get to that next time. But what we want is to occupy space. It speaks to who we are. We want something that speaks to our humanity. And then what helps people to get there, in terms of when you start talking about aesthetics, as far as I'm concerned, is people who are artists and designers in how it is that you interpret whatever the landscape is, whatever the cultural resources are. How do you interpret it? How creatively do you interpret it? Just even in terms of, forget about putting pen to paper, let's just talk about it. And I give an example, and in a conversation I had with Charles, when I meet up with communities, there's some people who will say, Peggy, You know, there are lots of burial grounds everywhere, you know, I mean, why should that stop us from building? And when I speak about African-American burial grounds or burial grounds where enslaved and free people are there, what I say to them is that I'm reminded by archaeologists and anthropologists that what defines us in part as human is how we bury our dead. So I thought about that, how we bury our dead. We pray over them, we pour libations over them, we sing, we do all of these various things. And that's what in part defines us. So imagine a community who is living in a society that deems them inhuman, that says they have no right, that a white man need respect, that you are subhuman. And on the occasion that they have lost a mother or a father under this umbrella of oppression, enslavement, and they are given an opportunity to go to a place to pray over, pour libation, sing, and engage in some form of ceremony, what they're doing is they're attempting to reclaim the humanity of that individual in a society that says that you are inhuman. And in that moment, when they put and lay that body in the ground and they engage in that ceremony, for me, that is in fact an act, a revolutionary act of remembrance, given the society of oppression that they are in. So whether someone comes along 100 years from now and takes the bodies out of the ground, that ground is sacred because of what happened there. We in this country, we preserve battlegrounds. We have national parks that are battlegrounds. Well, when I think of an African-American and that kind of history, the way I interpret it, and so I share that with the community, and I share that with designers with the idea that you will think about this burial ground differently or with another dimension. That is not only a place where bodies lie. This cemetery is for the living. It is a place that I will always respect and remember as a place where a revolutionary act of remembrance took place.
You're being cheered in the chat.
Yes, yes. I appreciate that. And I just want to add just two things, and I'm pretty sure we have to move to another question. But as you are talking, Peggy, what I'm also hearing is this erasure that has taken hold of our memorial landscape. When I said earlier that like our current stock of memorials are a complete misrepresentation of our current society. And so, yes, in some ways, there are a number of communities across this country that are simply just trying to play catch up in terms of how they are represented in the public memorial landscape. But also, I would say we are essentially fighting, if you will, for territory, especially in a moment in time where we're dealing with critical race theory and the missed opportunities to actually fully, accurately educate our children. And if we can't do that in schools, and if we can't do that in textbooks, then we have to figure out a way to do it in the public realm, in the memorial landscape. And even if 50 years from now, we can't protect these memorial landscapes that we are creating, they at least existed. And when somebody attempts to undermine them and take them down and contest them, there has to be a conversation around what you're doing or why you're doing it and whose story you're attempting to erase in that, right? And so the work that I would say that we are currently doing right now, amongst others, is this attempt to not rewrite history, but to expand who is represented in the history, understanding that for so long, there are too many communities, too many identities that have been erased, denied, marginalized, and deprioritized in the public landscape. And so the question that I believe I heard you asking earlier, James, in terms of what we're testing, I would say, you know, so many folks, Peggy, when you were saying that the person on the street doesn't necessarily have the language, it's in part because for so long we've just been taught to stare at statues, just go to it, say you were there, and walk away. Whereas now there's this opportunity, especially with like kinfolk and the way that they're using technology, there's an opportunity to engage with the memorialization, right? There's an opportunity to have living active, participatory memorials, monuments, spaces in which you as a visitor, you as a person are meant to come and do something. Come and take something away. Come be transformed and changed by this experience, and then go back into the world with this information and do something about it. It is not enough to say that you visited it, you saw it, you took a picture and you walked away, but ultimately, how do we, in that moment in time, that brief moment in time that we as artists and architects and designers and activists have you in this space, what is the information and the experience that we can put on you to transform you such that you leave differently than which you came? And I would say that is the current charge, or one of the charges in memorializations today.
Agreed.
Well, the Peace and Justice Memorial, which I have not yet seen in person, just seems like such a powerful expression of that. And I can't imagine what you went through to get it done, since probably people said, oh, it's too negative, it's, it should be, there should be uplift, et cetera. I don't know what you went through, but we are kind of running out of time. I think what I will do is read a little bit of a comment, and then any, I think, final remarks you want to make. As a diversity officer, the weight of DEIA work is so heavy at times. How do you all find the strength to continue your work when the cultural and political landscapes are fighting against sharing and informing the world of this forgotten, lost, intentionally buried history? I think you've talked about that a little bit, but if that urges you to say anything more.
I'll say something,
Yeah.
which is, as Charles repeated, I am my ancestors' unfinished business. I was born in the basement of a segregated hospital in Albany, Georgia, Southwest Georgia, right? I grew up, the first time I remember getting a library card, because Black people couldn't go to the library in my town. My mother took me to get a library card. I saved that library card forever. Those kinds of experiences you do not forget. It's as if you were a child and somebody punched you in the face every single day, it's something you will never forget and you carry with you. So this work is deeply rooted personally, and it's something when I see or I go to the Peace and Justice Memorial, that is real. It resonates with me. I mean, it's one of the most powerful memorials and monuments that I think is in this country, just because it speaks to my truth. And that's what fuels the work that I do in this country and globally.
Any other additions?
Yeah, I will say my son. My son is what fuels this work for me. Now, you asked James, did they teach you this in school? No, they did not. But the fact that it exists, that there's an opportunity to expand narratives and to reflect differently on how the built environment does or does not reflect my likeness, my experience, my identities, is a challenge for me. It's an opportunity to say, if I'm not feeling represented, seen, and therefore protected and safe, then I can imagine that there are way too many other folks that also aren't. And I think about how, as a child, like my mom, sorry, speaking of my son, it was my time, my turn. But just thinking about times where my mother and I would go to various cities, Washington, DC, Boston, et cetera, and walk around the memorial landscape, and I not once heard my story, myself, my grandmother's represented in, God bless you, the public landscape. And so to be able to change that for him is enough to push me past the BS of the challenge, but also it's enough to uplift me in the weight of the work, because the work is weighted without the political strife, as it were, right? It is just traumatic to relive some of these stories and these histories, but I am encouraged by him.
Well, there's such spectacular energy here, but I guess we do have to stop. Charles, do you have anything to add at the end here?
Yeah, maybe I can just sort of close with a comment and a question. First of all, thank you to everyone today. I've never seen so many floating hearts and clapping emojis on any webinar I've attended. Peggy, thanks for making me almost cry twice. But one of the things I was reflecting on during Jha D's presentation is in just the brief moment that she spoke about the embrace, I learned so much about that project that didn't appear anywhere when that commemorative gesture was revealed. I remember one particular piece referring to it, for example, as a new memorial in a park in Beantown. And, you know, we've been talking about storytelling, and we've also had the good fortune of having a celebrated critic moderate this session. And I think perhaps maybe one of our next conversations on this topic through the lens of storytelling is how we reveal this work to a larger audience. And I'll leave everyone with something that appears, and I encourage people to go to the Mass Design website to read the narrative about the embrace, because when I was searching at the time of the opening, the narrative and the photos that are there today were not there then. And it concludes with, how can we demand more memorials that unite us around our common humanity, love, and empathy? And I can't think of a better note to end on today. So thank you to everyone, and here's to the future.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Justin and Peggy, we should do this more often.
Yes.
Yes.
Lunch next week.
Yes, let's do it. We'll figure it out.
Yes, yeah.
Take
Have a
care.
good afternoon, everyone.
I know.
All right.
Does the little guy have anything to add? Okay, bye. Thank you all.